Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, Principles and Policies of Low and Moderate Income Solar, and this is part 4, Direct Incentives that can be used for low and moderate income solar. This webinar is presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, as part of the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar in Your Community Challenge. My name is Diana Chase, and I'm a program associate here at CESA, and I'll be moderating this webinar. In just a moment, I'll pass it over to our presenter for this webinar, Ben Paulus of Paulus Analysis. But first, I'd like to go over some background information. Today's webinar is the fourth in a series of 8 individual presentations. In this presentation, you'll hear about direct incentives for low and moderate income solar projects. To watch webinar recordings or to sign up for the next session of webinar presentations, you can visit the web address you see on your screen. These webinars are free and available to the public. They are particularly geared toward participants in the Solar in Your Community Challenge. For those of you participating in the Solar in Your Community Challenge, I wanted to let you know about an important resource we're offering, virtual office hours. All of our instructors for this webinar series will be available for one-on-one consultations. To learn more about this and to schedule a consultation, please email me, Diana Chase, at the email address you see on your screen. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Ben Paulus. Ben is the principal at Paulus Analysis and a CESA board member. He's an independent consultant and writer based in Berkeley, California. He provides consulting services on energy policy, technology, and trends to nonprofits, government agencies, foundations, and corporations, and is a regular contributor to Green Tech Media, Power Magazine, and other publications. Ben will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then he'll take some questions. Ben?
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. I'm Ben Paulus. I'm a consultant based in Berkeley, California. And I do a lot of work on low-income solar issues with CESA and state agencies and nonprofits. I'm going to be talking about direct incentives for low-income solar. There we go. The learning objectives for this part of the curriculum are first to understand what those direct incentives are, what's available for distributed solar, and then to talk about how they do or don't work for low-income households. First, the most fundamental incentive, and I hesitate to call it an incentive because it's really just an accounting method, is net metering. It's still the most common supportive policy for residential customers. However, it's been there's been a strenuous debate happening over the last 5 years or so about net metering. Now that solar is becoming cost-effective and widespread, there are a large number of customers who are using net metering. Even though net metering has been on the books for decades in most states, it was rarely used because solar was not very cost-effective. Now that we have solar in over 1 million households in the United States, it is starting to make a large impact. And a number of utilities and state regulators are pushing to replace it, reconsider it, or redesign critical aspects of it, all of which are extremely important for the value of solar for customers, and especially for low-income customers who will be impacted the most by this kind of thing. To keep up with what's happening, I recommend this report on the screen here called 50 States of Solar from the North Carolina Clean Energy Center. If you just search for 50 States of Solar, you'll find it. They put out a quarterly update on the status of net metering, the net metering debate around the country. Net metering can be even more valuable if it's combined with time of use rates. Rate design is really critical to the value of distributed solar. Time of use rates can recognize the on-peak production value of solar, but it really depends on what times of day we're talking about that are the peaks. For community solar, a derivation of net metering is called virtual net metering, which, if you're not familiar with that, it is essentially where an off-site solar system is considered to be behind your meter. The output from that off-site system is credited to the customer's meter as if it were on the roof, and the energy savings is directly credited. That's not very common, but it is in a number of states. Here's a map of net metering. It's still common in most states. However, as I said, it's been very contentious, and it's really not as straightforward as it used to be because states are tweaking it in different ways in a variety of what they tend to call successor programs, which may still be net metering, but they may have different rules, different cost structures, different rate designs that have a huge impact on the value of it. A very clear incentive for solar is a rebate or a tax credit, and the most common one is the federal residential tax credit of 30%. That is being phased out over the coming years. This graph here shows that it steps down between now and 2022 and disappears completely in 2023 for residential customers. Commercial customers will continue to have a 10% credit. However, residential customers will not. It'll be 0. An important factor with the tax credit for low-income households is it's a credit against your income tax, which means you have to be paying enough income tax in order to capture the credit. And you have to do that over 2 years. It can be carried over 1 year. So if you are a low-income household and you don't have enough of a tax appetite, then you'll miss out on some of that credit, and that can be a big problem for low-income households. A number of states continue to have tax credits and rebates as well, but the trend there is also to reduce the size and to generally phase them out. A few states have extra incentives specifically tailored for low-income customers. In California, the Single-Family Affordable Solar Housing Program, SASH. New York has a double payment of their incentive for low-income households. And Illinois has a new program that's just rolling out now in response to the Future Energy Jobs Act, FEJA. This Illinois Power Agency just the other day released their draft plan for their distributed solar program for comment, and I got to work with them on that. So if you are in Illinois or active there, please feel free to comment on that draft plan. In a few states, they have renewable power standards that have set-asides for solar or a specific requirement for solar deployment. To track compliance, they use renewable energy credits, or RECs. Solar RECs are referred to as SRECs. And there are 6 states that have SREC trading that I mentioned here, mostly in the East. The prices of SRECs can vary extremely widely depending on market demand, market dynamics. They currently range everywhere from 0.35 cents a kilowatt hour all the way up to almost 43 cents per kilowatt hour in DC. So depending on where you are, this can be an extremely important incentive, or it can be not at all important. And in places where it's been a large incentive, it's been really critical to making low-income solar work because it provides a really big incentive for low-income households. Another fairly rare incentive is the value of solar tariff. I should say it's rare in the United States. It's very common worldwide. It's generally referred to as a feed-in tariff, where a regulator sets a price for production of renewable energy from distributed systems or large systems, and the customer owning the system sells all their power to the utility or to the grid, and then they buy their power separately at the normal retail rate. So they're not really producing their own power. They're a small power generator selling into the power system and getting paid at this rate. The value of solar concept is based on not on the cost of solar or on the retail price or the wholesale price of electricity, but on how much the solar is actually worth to society and to the system. Minnesota and Austin, Texas are the two clear examples of this, where the value is added up, avoided fuel cost, as you see in this chart, as well as an environmental cost from avoided pollution. In New York State, they're developing a location-based tariff called VDER, the Value of Distributed Energy Resource, where the value of a solar system will depend on where it is in the grid, on the idea that it can support, make the grid more resilient, reduce congestion, and avoid other expensive upgrades. Much more common are third-party contracts, or PPAs. These are not necessarily an incentive for solar, but also just a way to make the deal happen. It can be very useful for a low-income homeowner because they may not have enough tax appetite to capture the residential tax credit. They may not have savings to put the money down and simply buy a system. Low-income homeowners, while there's a perception that low-income households have poor credit, it's not entirely true from the research I've seen when it comes to low-income homeowners, because low-income homeowners have a mortgage, they pay their bills, they have a credit history, and therefore they tend to have better credit. Research by the Connecticut Green Bank has shown that, and there's more research underway from other sources. So it's starting to look like homeowners are different, low-income homeowners are different than low-income renters, and maybe more attractive to the solar installers that offer third-party purchase agreements or leases or loans. It's also especially attractive where a homeowner has a high electric bill and high electric rates that can help solar pencil out and be more valuable. However, third-party PPAs tend to have a higher cost of finance than other sources like a home equity loan or simply paying cash. PPAs tend to have a price escalator, so you sign up at one rate at the beginning and it rises over time, and that increase may be higher than the increase in electric rates. You don't really know. So it may or may not save money over time. It's not legal everywhere. A number of states have prohibited it. Other states have where it's simply not clear. And in some states it is very clear that it is allowable. It also doesn't really work for renters, and a large number of low-income households are renters. Here's a map of third-party contracts from the Desire website that tracks state policies in every state. 26 states and Puerto Rico and DC do allow third-party purchase agreements. There are a number of states, mostly in the southeast, where it's specifically disallowed, not allowed, and in a lot of other states it's simply not clear. And there have been legal cases in Wisconsin and Iowa that I've heard about where they're really trying to work that out in lieu of legislation. So that's a quick overview of some of the direct incentives for solar. There's much more information on the CESA website, that's Clean Energy States Alliance, CESA.org, where a report I have is posted called Bringing the Benefits of Solar to Low-Income Households. That really has a much more complete treatment of all of the incentives and financing issues around low-income solar. But we now have time for some questions, so I welcome those.
Thank you, Ben. You mentioned extra incentives for low-income solar in California, New York, and Illinois. We got a question, what is New York's double incentive for LMI residents?
Yeah, sorry, I went over that kind of quickly. New York has a statewide incentive program for solar of all kinds. It's a declining block program, which is that the rebate declines as the volume of solar is deployed. It varies by different parts of the state and by different customer classes. So for example, there is a residential program in the Con Ed service territory, and the rebate price declines not over time, but over volume as solar is installed. The New York policy, I believe, is to essentially double the rebate price that's offered in each of these block programs. What I've also heard is that that incentive has not been sufficient to result in much low-income solar. It's not large enough, for one, and for another, low-income customers, it's not simply a matter of money. I've come to believe that there are a number of structural and market barriers to low-income solar around finance and other issues. So simply offering a higher rebate is not always enough to solve those problems. I think the most successful low-income solar programs have been ones that have created a number of supportive mechanisms to deploy low-income solar, not simply offering a bigger incentive. So having a low-cost financing option is important. Having an administrator who understands the market and can help customers along. Deploying other tactics to reduce costs. Those are all very important supportive mechanisms that are going to result in better impacts.
Okay, and here's another question. Can you go into more detail about example PPAs for LMI customers? Are there PPAs that have been created specifically for LMI customers, and how are they different from typical PPAs?
Yeah, I'd refer you to a company called Posigen, P-O-S-I-G-E-N. Posigen is a solar developer that really focuses on low-income customers. They work only in Louisiana, Connecticut, and New York currently because they rely on supportive policy environments to make it work. So for example, in Connecticut, they work with the Connecticut Green Bank to offer low-cost finance. They work with a marketing firm whose name I'm forgetting right now. Smart Power, is that it? I think it's called Smart Power, to do solarized campaigns where they do intensive marketing in a town among low-income households to really recruit, a lot of households all at once in order to get a bulk deal, a bulk discount. So it's still, and they do offer a third-party PPA contract where Posigen owns the system and sells the power to the customer. They often don't rely on a credit score to determine eligibility. Instead, they'll look at alternative metrics like their utility bill payment history, or simply, skip a measurement and take the chance of default. And they found that the default rates have been fairly low and have not been a major problem. I've also heard of some cases where an entity will essentially serve as a backstop for low-income customers that may default. So if especially with community solar, where you'll have subscriptions allocated to low-income households, if they are unable to pay them, then the subscription will be absorbed by a larger customer, like a church or corporation, that agrees to be a sort of a swing customer to take over the bills of low-income households. So really, if you want more detail on the Posigen approach, I would look at their website and look at some of the materials from Connecticut especially.
Okay. And then we have somebody asking, why do SRECs have no value in Maryland, Ohio, and Pennsylvania?
Yeah, because they're because of the forces of supply and demand, they're worth very little right now. If you can look on this chart here on the screen, down here are some of those states: Pennsylvania, Ohio. These are states where either the supply is large or the demand is low, or you know, the relative relationship is such that they aren't worth much. So Maryland, for example, I think the RECs are, you know, $8 a piece, I think I heard. So $8 per megawatt hour, or what's that, 0.8 cents. It's really not worth much, and it's not even worth enough to manage the transaction costs. So Massachusetts, for example, it's ironic. In some states, the SRECs are very low cost, and that's good or bad depending on your perspective. In other states where the SRECs have been very high cost, they're trying to address that. Massachusetts is actually moving away from an SREC system into a more like a feed-in tariff system. Honestly, it's an administratively set rate for solar, and that's in the works, and they're, I think, still taking comments on that.
Okay, here's another question. How can low-income homeowners take advantage of the federal tax credit if they don't have enough income tax appetite?
Yeah, I mentioned some aspects of that. The first thing to remember is that the tax credit can be carried over from one year to the next. So if you have a, you know, $3,000 tax credit, you can split it up across the 2 years, and that can help absorb it if the household has some tax appetite. If that's not sufficient, a third-party deal can monetize the tax credit. That's where a developer will own the system and take the tax credit and pass the savings on to the customer in the form of a lower bill. With low-income households, that really depends on a third-party developer being willing to work with low-income households. And that's, as I mentioned, that's not all are willing to do that. Some are, and that's a role for state policy, I think, to reduce the risk of that kind of a transaction and making it attractive for third-party developers to work with low-income households.
Okay, thank you. And then here's another question for you. Have you seen any growth in PPAs over the last few years in the public sector in particular?
Like with commercial customers?
I assume the public sector refers to things like schools and government buildings.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I assume so. I don't have any particular knowledge about that. I would think they would still be fairly attractive. I know there is a large program in California for solar on schools, and the cases, the projects I have heard about, just a few anecdotes, I think they have used third-party PPAs because the public institutions are also not able to monetize the federal tax credit. So the the third-party vendor is able to do that for them and to sell them the power. So anecdotally, I've heard that it's popular, at least in California, so I assume it would be popular elsewhere.
Okay. How about this? In states that are moving away from net metering or making it less valuable, are there still ways to make customer-owned solar pencil out?
Yeah, so this, as I mentioned, the 50 states of solar is a good source for finding out what's going on in your state. I personally think net metering is a critical way to deliver the value of distributed solar to the customer who owns it, and it's especially critical for low-income households. One of the first, and even in places where net metering is continuing, there have been a number of changes in the rate design that have generally made it less attractive to homeowners. For example, a number of utilities have and states have proposed imposing a fixed charge on every bill, or increasing the fixed charge. So instead of paying a small fixed amount and then paying your bill based on the amount of electricity you consume, it would switch to a system where you pay a larger fixed amount and the rate for electricity would decline. So you would pay more in a fixed component and less in a variable component. That is extremely bad for low-income households. It's extremely bad for energy efficiency, which is encouraged to reduce electric consumption, and it's terrible for solar. States that have adopted or are considering larger fixed charges, that's a real threat to low-income solar and low-income energy efficiency. Another rate design is to vary the price based on time of day, a time of use rate. That can be very beneficial to solar, which tends to produce on peak. However, it also depends on what time of day the peak is and whether it corresponds with solar output. In California here, they've been moving the peak time more into the evening when solar is declining, so solar is getting edged out of that peak value. In most other places, however, it tends to coincide very well. In any case, self-consumption is, I believe, always allowed. You can always offset your own consumption. The problem there is that solar produces most during the day. Most people are off at work during the day or at school, and their consumption tends to be lower in the daytime and higher in the evenings. So, theoretically, you can have battery systems to shift that production. However, batteries are still very expensive, and I think they're very unlikely to pencil out for low-income households or any kind of household. They're really much more for commercial customers. But having, self-consumption, if that's the state policy, then it tends to be, it can cause problems because it encourages people to increase their consumption, household consumption on peak. And the goal of most, rate structures is to reduce peak demand. This would be a perverse incentive to encourage solar homeowners to increase demand on peak. So, I think the main thing I would say is that if net metering is being eroded in your state, that you should, as a low-income solar advocate, you could speak out in favor of it because it's a really bedrock way to capture the value of solar for low-income households.
Okay, and here's a little bit of a broader question. It seems it's much more feasible to provide solar programs that benefit low-income customers through institutions like schools, multifamily housing, churches, and community institutions to take advantage of bulk purchasing power. I'm interested in your thoughts on this approach versus focusing on LMI households.
Yeah, that is a very good observation, and I had the same thought after writing the report that institutions, yeah, first of all, they're larger customers, so they have economies of scale. Second of all, they can be more sophisticated customers, that they can manage more complex financial arrangements. And, you know, the larger scale of their project allows engineering costs and, you know, balance of system costs to be absorbed, all the soft costs to be reduced. There are fewer of them, so the transaction costs are much lower. And especially for nonprofit and public institutions that provide services to low-income communities, that it can provide a direct savings to them that they can use to redirect into their service delivery. So if you have a food kitchen that spends, you know, $1,000 a month on their electric bill, if they didn't have to spend $1,000 on the month on their electric bill, they could spend it on delivering food, which is their primary mission. One caveat, though, is that a food kitchen, for example, their primary mission is delivering food. It's not becoming a solar generating company. So you have to make it very simple for them, and you have to, you know, just like anyone, you have to reduce the risk of their investment and make their time investment very small as well. So, you know, making it easy for them is especially important, and it's a good role for state policy as well as for marketers. And in the report, actually, I have some examples of companies that are focused on that particular market, on nonprofit institutions. For example, there's a company that does crowdsource funding, crowd finance, for churches, for example, where they will install the solar system on the church, and the church members will be the financiers that will invest in the project on behalf of the church. So it has its own built-in investment audience. You know, a lot of these nonprofit groups have their own communities that they can turn to for investment. So I think it's a very it's a good opportunity, and has not really fully been explored yet.
Great, and I have just one final question for you. Is it easier to do low-income solar for individual homeowners or for multifamily housing?
You know, both are difficult. They both have their own challenges. Just like with nonprofits or public, you know, government customers, a multifamily housing owner can also be a more sophisticated customer. Can have lower transaction costs and have access to all of these other financial incentives through HUD programs, low-income housing tax credit, the new market tax credit, commercial PACE, which is available, I think, everywhere, in more places than residential PACE, at least. So, you know, likewise, a multifamily housing owner can be more attractive because of all of these options than an individual homeowner. On the other hand, they also have problems based on having multiple meters in their apartment building, assuming they have individual unit meters, or if they have a single master meter. That can be critical about who benefits from a solar investment on multifamily housing. The rules about housing assistance from HUD can be a big factor. HUD requires a low-income household to pay 30% of their income for housing and utilities. So if you save them money on their utilities, it may simply increase the amount they have to pay on their rent to get back up to that 30% level. So HUD has been very interested in ways to transfer the benefits of solar and energy efficiency to the customer directly. And that seems to be true still with the change in administration. I think what I've heard is they are still interested in ways to solve the problem for public housing and publicly assisted housing. I think there's also a lot to be done with multifamily housing. That's another unexplored area. And it does have a number of benefits over working with individual households.
Okay. Thank you, Ben, for your excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended this webinar and participated in our Q&A. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to every question that was submitted. If you have follow-up questions, or if you'd like to schedule a consultation as part of our virtual office hours, please email me at diana@cleanegroup.org. We hope you'll check out the other 7 presentations in this webinar series. For more information about this webinar series, you can visit the web address on your screen. This web page includes links to webinar recordings, as well as links to register for our upcoming November 17th webinar. We hope to see you there.